All right, today's lesson is going to take us to Luke chapter 16, verses 1 to 13. The Wall Street Journal once quoted an anonymous writer who defined money this way. He said, "Money is an article which may be used as a universal passport to everywhere except heaven, and as a universal provider for everything except happiness." Well, that writer could have also added the fact that the money is a provoker of covetousness and competition. And even though it's a wonderful servant, it is a terrible master. We read in the book of Proverbs, "Do not toil to acquire wealth. Be discerning enough to detest. When your eyes light on it, it is gone. For suddenly it sprouts wings, flying like an eagle toward heaven." Those verses certainly remind us that if we're not careful, wealth can disappear very quickly. When you do your taxes at the end of the year, aren't you amazed by how much money has passed through your hands in the preceding year? And then you wonder where it all went. We're equally amazed at how little we have to show for it. But more importantly, we need to think about how spending all that money affected us spiritually. Jesus spoke a lot about money. After all, most of the people he ministered to were poor, and they felt that obtaining more money would be the solution to all of their problems, and many people feel that way today. He also knew that the act of making money and spending money occupies most of our waking hours. But he never said anything about how to make more money or how to spend less money. He simply encouraged us to be good stewards of whatever financial resources God has given to us. That is the basic truth about money. It's not ours. Instead, God has simply entrusted it to our care, and He tells us that we are to be good and prudent, use it in a prudent manner. This means that how we use our money is a good way to assess our true spiritual condition. And since every one of us is going to stand before Jesus one day and give an account of what we did with what He has given us, it would pay us to listen to what Jesus has to say today in today's scripture passage about using our money. Well, the parable that we're going to look at today concerns two of the most unique rascals that are found written within the pages of Scripture. Jesus always seemed to take great pleasure in shocking the religious prudes of the day, and that's why we have this story. During Jesus' time here on earth, He spoke to large crowds of people. These crowds would very often include tax collectors and other people who weren't known for their honesty. Then included in that crowd were undesirables who were also the religious leaders. They were usually there to try to discredit what Jesus was saying, but at least they were there. Well, Jesus' true followers were also included in His audience. This group included the 12, along with the larger number of followers who showed various levels of commitment to Him. And this is the group that Jesus is telling this parable to. Following Christ is much more demanding than simply acknowledging who He is. His true disciples not only agree to obey what He says, they also agree to arrange their priorities for His sake. They are to serve Him as a slave serves his master. These devout followers wanted to be just like Him in both the way He thought and the way He acted. Well, in order to clarify what their attitude toward money should be, Jesus tells them a parable about a rich man and his manager. Look at verse 1. He also said to His disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager. We know that during Jesus' day, rich landowners would very often lease their land to farmers in much the same way that they do today. A wealthy landowner would lease his land to a tenant farmer in return for a share of the crop. My grandfather leased his farm from a rich lady who lived in Snow Hill, North Carolina. Each one would pay half of the cost of running the farm, and then when my grandfather sold the crop, he would give half of the money to her. Well, in those days, rather than handling the details of the business himself, these landowners would very often hire a business manager to do it for them. Now, these business managers could be slaves or they could be hired employees. In the movie Ben-Hur, Sam Jaffe played the part of a slave named Simonides, and he was Judah Ben-Hur's business manager. The job of these business managers was to oversee his master's estate and make sure that the land was productive. He would lease the land and collect the rents that were due on the land. He would also administer any debts that the farmers would owe to the landowner. Well, these managers were given a lot of freedom in how they handled the master's money, and they weren't always honest or competent in the way they did it. Well, this seems to be the case with the manager in Jesus' story. Look back at verse 1. And charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean the manager was stealing. It says that he was wasting his possessions. Maybe he was keeping a little bit more of it for himself than he should have, or maybe he was just incompetent. A manager is someone who manages another person's wealth. He does not own the wealth that he is responsible to manage, but he does have the privilege of enjoying it and using it for the profit of his master. And I'm sure that the manager is allowed to keep some of the profits for himself. This gave the manager the incentive to work hard to maximize the profits. The most important thing for a manager to do was to faithfully serve his master. Whenever he looks at the riches around him, he needs to remember that it all belongs to his master and not to him personally, and that it must be used in a way that would both please and profit his master. Well, in this case, the master forgot that he was there to manage someone else's money, and apparently started acting as though he was the owner, and he started wasting the master's possessions. And when his master heard about it, he sent word to the manager to turn in his records. And if they weren't in order, he was going to be relieved of his duties. And he called him and said to him, "What is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager." Now, this short period of time wasn't intended for the manager's benefit. It was intended to allow time for the books to be audited. Because of this, we can assume that this manager was a slave who had no choice but to stay there. But if he was found guilty of the charge against him, he would be demoted to a lesser position. He may have been put to work as a field hand. Now, before we condemn this man too severely, we need to examine our own lives and see if we have been faithful stewards of what God has given to us. You see, we are only stewards of any material wealth we have, and we are going to be held accountable someday for how we acquired it and how we used it. Christian stewardship goes far beyond simply putting a check in the collection plate on Sunday morning and then using whatever we have left over any way we want to. True stewardship means that we thank God for everything we have and that we use whatever we have been given the way He directs us to use it. Deuteronomy chapter 8 says, "Take care lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping His commandments and His rules and His statutes which I commanded you today. Lest when you have eaten and are full and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply and your silver and gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart will be lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions, and thirsty ground where there was no water, who brought you water out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know, that He might humble you and test you to do you good in the end. Beware in the end that you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand has gotten me this wealth. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you power to get wealth, that He may confirm His covenant that He swore to your fathers as it is this day." So whenever you start patting yourself on the back for being able to earn enough money that you can lead a relatively comfortable life, it's time to sit down and think about all the things that God has done for you and thank Him for it. You see, without His help, you'd be living under a bridge right now. Now, giving some of your money to God's church is a way to begin being a faithful steward, but we also need to remember that God should control the rest of our money as well. We're also to be good stewards of our time. Paul wrote, "Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time, because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is." Well, how do you do that? How do you understand what the will of the Lord is? you attend a good Bible study. Time is made up of an eternity that has been divided into minutes. Then those minutes are given to us. I mean, we can either use those minutes wisely, or we can waste them carelessly. You see, Christians are able to be good stewards of the gifts and abilities that God has given them to use in His service. And we must also use those minutes for the benefit of others. The thief says, what is yours is mine, and I'm going to take it from you. The selfish man says, what is mine, and I'm going to keep it. But the Christian says, what is mine is a gift from God, and I am going to share it. The fact is, we are stewards of everything we have. And we must use our abilities to win lost souls to Christ and encourage the saints. And if God has blessed us with the ability to do it, we are to meet the needs of hurting people everywhere. Now, Christians are also to be good stewards of the gospel. Paul wrote, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak not to please men, but to please God who tests our hearts. Unfortunately, we're trying too hard today to keep people happy at the expense of keeping God happy. God has entrusted us with the treasures of His truth. Paul says, but we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. But we seem to think that we are doing what we do because we are powerful. We are also told to guard this treasure that God has given to us. Paul told Timothy, "O Timothy, guard the deposit entrusted to you. Avoid the irreverent babble and contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge." Unfortunately, there are fewer and fewer churches doing that today. They think nothing of ignoring what the Bible teaches in order to be politically correct. We're also told to invest this treasure in the lives of others. Paul wrote, and what you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. Satan would love nothing better than to rob the church of the great treasure that God has given us. So we must be alert, and we must be courageous. But more and more people who occupy church pews today are biblically illiterate. So they don't have the ability to entrust God's word to others because they have no knowledge of it themselves and have no desire at all to get that knowledge. And that's especially true of elders. Paul told Titus what an elder must do. He must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine and also to rebuke those who contradict it. Please tell me how an elder is supposed to do that if he has no idea what the trustworthy word and the sound doctrine really is. Just like this manager, we are going to be called on to give an account of how we use the things that God has entrusted to our care. If we have been faithful, the Lord will reward us. But if we have not been faithful, we will lose those blessings. You see, even though we will still be saved and we will enter heaven, if we mishandle what God has given to us, we will lose that portion of our reward. The evangelist Vince Habner once said, God called us to be good stewards, not to keep score. If we are good stewards of what God has given us, He will reward us generously. And that reward will glorify His name. All right, look at verse 3. And the manager said to himself, what shall I do? Since my master is taking the management away from me, I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. The fact that this manager didn't offer any defense for his actions tells us that the charges against him must have been true. So he starts thinking about his future. Many years of easy living had made him too weak to be a day laborer and to dig in the fields, and he's too proud to become a beggar. So what's he supposed to do? Well, the answer comes to him beginning in verse 4. I have decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. He decides to call in every debtor who owes money to his master and discount their bills. He figures that by forgiving a portion of their debt, the tenant farmer would be indebted to him, and that would make them feel some obligation to take him into their homes when the master throws him out. He cuts the first man's bill by 50%. The next man's bill is cut by 20%. The difference in the discounts may have been a reflection of how big each man's house was and how anxious the manager was to live there. Or it may have simply reflected the relative value of the different goods they produced. Now, it isn't really clear if what the manager was doing was legal or not. Normally, a manager would only cancel the debts of a farmer after he had consulted with the landowner. That would lead you to believe that what he was doing was wrong. However, some teachers feel that the manager was simply reducing the debt by the amount of interest that was due. You see, it was forbidden in Scripture to charge interest on a loan that was made to another Jew. But that law was usually ignored. So, if the manager was, in fact, just returning the illegal interest that the landowner was charging, there was no way that he could say anything about it. There was also a possibility that the manager had overcharged these men in the first place with the intention of pocketing the overcharge, and that he was just reducing the bills to what they should have been in the first place. Others feel that he was reducing the amount of the bill by a portion of the debt that was to be his commission. In this case, he was only giving away his own money. The other theory is the manager was actually giving away his master's money. But by reducing the debts of the farmers, that the manager was giving the impression that the landowner was being kind and merciful to these tenants. And if that were the case, when the landowner finally arrived in town to fire the manager, he would have been praised so highly by the farmers for his kindness that he couldn't very well have reversed the actions of his manager without looking like a complete idiot and alienating the entire town. So the landowner had no choice but to let the actions of that crooked manager stand. But whichever the case is, the manager had worked it out so that the farmers were in his debt. And the landowner really couldn't say a whole lot about what the manager had done, but what he did say is rather shocking. Look at verse 8. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. It seems that all the landowner could say was, what a clever crook. Well, it's because of that verse that this parable is one of the most difficult to interpret in all of the parables that Jesus told. But don't misunderstand what it says. Jesus is not condoning what this manager had done. That statement in verse 8 was made by the landowner, not Jesus. Take the case of Conrad Cujo. Conrad Cujo had an extraordinary ability to forge documents. In fact, his ability was so good that he had experts believing that his diaries of Adolf Hitler were the genuine article. Well, when Cujo was brought before the West German court, Judge Hans Schroeder complimented Cujo for his ability to make such good forgeries. Now, the judge was not complimenting Cujo for breaking the law. He was simply acknowledging his skill. Well, that's exactly what we have here. The landowner isn't complimenting the dishonest manager because he acted dishonestly. He's simply complimenting the manager's cleverness. So exactly what is Jesus trying to tell us here? Well, first off, we need to remember that the focus of this story is not on the characters. Our interest needs to stay focused on what Jesus said about this story. You see, the real focus of this story is on money. That's made very clear by how the Pharisees reacted in verse 14. The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things and they ridiculed him. They ridiculed Jesus because he dared to suggest that there was a connection between money and spirituality. You see, that is what Jesus is discussing here. He is commenting on the universal temptation among all of mankind to love money above everything else. And this story is meant to teach us what our attitude toward money should be. Jesus' first comment about the story is at the end of verse 8. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. He acknowledged the fact that dishonest people seem to know how to deal with other dishonest people better than honest people do. He also pointed out the fact that when it comes to sheer diligence, unsaved people are usually much more dedicated to their cause than saved people are. That's also true today when it comes to commitment and devotion to a goal. The children of this world are much more focused on than Christians are. This is what John Calvin had to say about that verse. But Christ only meant that ungodly and worldly men are more industrious and skillful in conducting the affairs of this fading life than the children of God are, careful to make eternal life the subject of their study and meditation. I mean, what an indictment of Christians. And that statement was made way back in the 16th century, and it's still true today. Do you know that there are Olympic athletes who are training at this very moment for a competition that isn't going to take place for another 2 to 4 years? There are businessmen who put in 70 to 80 hours a week in their climb up the corporate ladder. There are doctors who are willing to work 36 hours without a break. But there are children of God who will complain if the church service goes beyond the allotted time of 1 hour a week, and who do not open their Bibles or pray or even 5 minutes a day, or get up an hour earlier on Sunday to attend a Bible study. Olympic athletes will train for their competition more diligently than Christians will train for eternity. Look around you and you will find unbelievers everywhere that are willing to suffer any hardship and sacrifice anything they have in order to win the perishable crown that the world offers. These athletes are using everything at their disposal for the sake of this world. Shouldn't we be willing to do the same thing for God's kingdom? The one who knows Christ and the one who have been saved for the coming eternal kingdom should be willing to work even more diligently than for the imperishable crown of eternal life. I mean, isn't Jesus worth that kind of devotion? But most Christians today act like this life is all there is. Paul wrote, "Do you not know in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable." John Calvin wrote, "How disgraceful it is that the children of light should slumber and neglect the hope of eternal blessedness held out for them, while worldly men are so eagerly bent on their own accommodations." So what Jesus is saying is this: God alone is worthy of your devotion, your time, your talents, and your labors. And remember, we are not called on to be successful. We are only called on to be faithful. All right, look at verse 9. "And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings." The comment grows out of what Jesus had said in the end of verse 8. Namely, that the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. You see, within the narrow worldview, the sons of this world are the people who only live for this life. These are the people who feel that the limits of our existence are birth and death, and that the only events that are important are the ones that take place between those two events. They live by the philosophy, get all you can and can all you get, because tomorrow you die. Unfortunately, these people are usually more consistent and more persistent in obtaining their goals than Christians are, even though Christians have a much wider worldview. So in a nutshell, here's the point that Jesus is making. Here we have a manager, and even though he is a scheming, no-good crook, there is at least one good thing that can be said about him. He thinks about his future, and he prepares for it. He takes great pains to make sure that he is provided for in the future. He anticipates what's coming, and he spends a great deal of time and effort getting ready for it. And Jesus compliments him for that, but he never compliments him for the way he goes about doing it. You see, Jesus is telling us that since Christians understand that this life is only the preparation for the far greater life to come, they need to take the preparation for the new life more seriously. They need to acknowledge the fact that what we learn here is what prepares us to live there. And they need to understand the fact that if we fail to learn here, we will not be as ready as we should be for the new life to come. If they would only take these things more seriously, it would make a tremendous difference in what they do right now. You see, the most powerful motivation that there is to encourage people to study their Bible is that it helps them see exactly how the universe operates. And I'm not talking about the physical universe. I'm talking about the universe of social relationships. I'm talking about the things that God has in store for us right now, just as much as in the future. And this will affect how we relate to each other. The only place where that information is available is within the pages of the Bible. Once people catch into that truth, they'll want to read and study that book. A few years ago, I heard a woman on TV say that she had come to a place in her life where she had decided to put as much effort into studying the Bible as she had put into studying her real estate manual when she was trying to get her real estate license. She had this to say about the result. As a result, the book came alive, and I have grown so much and understand so much more since then. See, that is exactly the sort of attitude that Jesus is talking about here. The trouble with many Christians today is that they don't seem to take their view of life very seriously. If they did, they would put forth the same kind of effort in preparing for their future in heaven as unbelievers do in preparing in their future here on earth. The irony is found in the fact that the future that unbelievers are preparing for is only temporary, and it will crumble the very moment they die. If Christians would put forth the same kind of effort in planning their homes and caring for their families as they do in planning for a career in business and working for their next promotion, there wouldn't be nearly as many problems in Christian homes today. If we just studied our Bibles as diligently as we study the internet, we would understand the fact that the things we see written in Scripture are the great and important things of life. So Jesus says that we should be wise in the use of our money. You see, you can use the world's wealth for one of two things. You can use it to make friends with the world, which will mean nothing after you die, or you can use it to glorify God, and in the end, in that case, you'll be making friends who will welcome you into heaven. See, we need to use our money while it still has value. Don't avoid it. And don't pretend that matters concerning money are beneath you, or that the very way you handle your money is somehow separated from your spiritual life. It's not. Also, don't ever think that accumulating money is an end in itself. The thing to notice about this particular manager is that he was fully aware of the fact that money is something to be used. It has a purpose. It wasn't meant to be piled up and ignored. I realize that we do need to stash away some of it, but we aren't supposed to act like Ebenezer Scrooge and hoard it in a bank account just to watch it grow. The money that the Lord has given us is meant to be used for something, and we are to be good stewards of what God has given to us. This dishonest manager realized that he would only be able to use this money for a little while, and that he had to use it wisely while he had it. You see, just having the money wasn't an end in and of itself. He accomplished something with it. And a Christian is to use the money that he has as a temporary vehicle to accomplish permanent good. And Jesus says, if this unrighteous manager could use his understanding of the use of money to serve his own ends, then how much more could Christians use their understanding and the use of money to God's ends? Jesus said, and I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. In and of itself, money is neither righteous nor unrighteous. How you use it is what determines that. So money can't be considered to be righteous until it's used for a righteous purpose. There is no money in heaven. See, gold is so worthless in heaven, they use it as paving material. Precious jewels are so worthless that they use it as gravel in the mortar for the buildings. So money is something that belongs to this unrighteous world and is only temporary. No matter how much money you may accumulate in this lifetime, when you leave this earth, you are not going to have a penny. Unrighteous people like this dishonest manager will use their money to make earthly friends. But Christians are to use their money to promote God's kingdom and make heavenly friends. You see, the unrighteous wealth of this world can't last beyond this present life. And so when you die, the unrighteous money of this world loses its value. The heavenly friends that you have made by promoting God's kingdom will be there to welcome you into heaven. Jesus said this in the Sermon on the Mount. Do not lay up for yourselves treasure on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys or where thieves do not break in and steal. In other words, make friends by the proper use of money while it still has value. For there will come a day when the money itself will no longer have any value, but the good that you accomplished with it will live forever, and that will never lose its value. You see, by using your money to promote God's kingdom, the people who are ultimately saved by your efforts will be waiting to greet you in heaven. Oh, why is that important? Jesus told us in Luke chapter 12 and Matthew chapter 6, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. One day a young man was telling his pastor about it, his uncle, and he said, my uncle died a millionaire. Well, the pastor said, no, he didn't. At that point, the young man was a little annoyed, and he said, well, how do you know? You don't even know my uncle. The pastor said, no, I didn't know him, but I know that he didn't die a millionaire. And the young man said, how do you know that? The pastor said, who has the money now? Your uncle died a pauper. Remember, no one dies a millionaire. I haven't seen a hearse towing U-Haul yet. Every one of us leaves this world in poverty. Someone sent me a story a few years ago about a stingy old lawyer who wanted to disprove the idea that you can't take your wealth with you. So he devised a plan to take at least some of his fortune with him when he died. He told his wife to withdraw enough cash from the bank to fill 2 pillowcases. Then he instructed her to take them to the attic and put them directly over his bed. His plan was to reach up and grab the pillowcases on his way to heaven. Well, he died several weeks later, and after the funeral, his wife went up into the attic and she saw the 2 forgotten pillowcases stuffed with money. And she says, that silly old coot, I knew I should have put him in the basement. I learned several years ago that morticians are sometimes called on to supply suits for funerals. Well, one of the distinctive things about these suits is that they don't have pockets. See, they don't need them where they're going. Look back at verse 9. Notice what Jesus said about money in this verse. He didn't say, if it fails. He says, when it fails. Unrighteous mammon cannot last. The manager in this parable only had it for a few days. And that is the whole point of the story. He only had the money for a few days. And that's all the time he had to use the money to his best advantage. And he used it while he had it. He didn't try to save it. He didn't bury it in a box in the backyard. He put it to work. If we rely on money, it will always fail us. And that's going to happen sooner than you think. Someone once said this about money. You can't take it with you, but you ain't going nowhere without it. And you can't take it with you is a very true statement. That part anyway. Use what you have to do good while you still have it. Use it today for the purpose that will transcend life itself. Don't simply use it for the things that will benefit you here and now. Use it for the things that will benefit you even after you're dead. Use it to help the sick, the poor, and the ignorant. Use it to spread the truth about God. Use it to feed the hungry. Your money is going to lose its value all too soon, and it will be useless if you don't use it properly. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't pay your bills, but remember, God is your number one creditor. Think about that before you make those bills. Paul picked up on this when he told Timothy, as for the rich in the present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. All right, look at verse 10. One who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much. And one who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. This comment comes out of the fact that the unrighteous manager was fired. Even though his master complimented him on his cleverness, he was still fired. You see, that this dishonest manager would have been much better off if he'd used his talents honestly. You see, his master found out that he was unfaithful in little things, so he suspected that he was probably unfaithful in everything he did. So he fired him. You know, if you want to see what a person's true character is, pay attention to how he handles his money. You and I really can't see what's going on inside of a person's heart, and that even includes other believers. But we can listen to what they say. We can see them going to church every week. We can watch them as they go through the various rituals of the church. And that might give us the impression that all of them are good, solid, dependable, trustworthy Christians. But you need to pay attention to how they handle their money. See, if a person is unfaithful in the unimportant things, he's going to be unfaithful in the important things as well. If he's careless with his unrighteous money, chances are he's going to be careless with the truth. Jesus doesn't leave it at that. He goes on in verses 11 and 12. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you with the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? Now the word who in both those verses is referring to God. I mean, it's silly to think that God is going to reward people who sinfully waste their opportunity to be faithful in the use of their unrighteous wealth in this life. Later on, Paul would tell the church that their leaders must be men of good reputation. Not only must they be well thought of by the church, they must also be well thought of by the people outside of the church as well. They must also be men who have impeccable reputations in business and financial affairs. In other words, if they aren't faithful in the unimportant things, like how they handle their money, then they won't be trustworthy handlers of the greater things of God. So how a person handles his money is a very good indicator of his character, because it's a very good indicator of where his heart is. Jesus said that your heart will be with whatever you value the most. So what Jesus is saying is this: if you can't faithfully handle earthly riches and power, then God isn't going to give you spiritual riches and power. And the amount of the riches isn't the issue in this parable. It's the character of the manager. You see, Jesus wasn't just talking about rich people here. He was talking about all of us. You know, it's really a tragic thing to see how God's wealth is being wasted by Christians who have decided to live their lives as if Jesus was never coming back. Jesus tells us that nothing material really belongs to us. It's only loaned to us for a few years and we're here on earth. We may think we hold the deed to our house or the title to our car, but we don't. Those things are only loaned to us. They really don't belong to us, they belong to God. And when we die, God's going to give them to somebody else. So Jesus says that we can't even properly handle the temporary things of this world, the things that God has allowed us to use while we're here. Who will give you that which is your own? To the believer, that which is your own are the things that Jesus promised to give us as a part of his inheritance. It includes all the things that Christ can be to you. But if you prove to be weak in the temporary things, then that shows that you are also weak in the permanent things. Did you know that God has supplied more than enough to meet the needs of every single church in the world? Problem is, he gave it to the congregation and asked them to pass it on to the church, but they decided to keep it for themselves. Every one of us should be eager to meet people in heaven who are there because we helped them pay the bill for the gospel to reach them. And that starts at home. The poet and philosopher Henry Thoreau wrote, "A man's wealth is in proportion to the number of things that he can afford to do without." Jacob Stam once prayed, "Lord, the only thing we know about sacrifice is how to spell the word." Well, I wonder if some of us can even spell the word today. You ever wonder why the Lord is so concerned about how we use our money? Simple, because money is not neutral. He called it unrighteous wealth. Paul says, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil." Now, like I said, in and of itself, money isn't evil at all. But it can place great temptations in your path. Only God can sanctify money and use it for good, but by its very nature, money defiles anyone who loves it and lets it control their lives. The theologian Richard Foster wrote, "We cannot safely use mammon until we are absolutely clear that we are dealing with not just mammon, but with unrighteous mammon." This leads to Jesus' comment in verse 13. "No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." The emphasis here is on the word "and." You cannot serve God and money. You have to recognize the fact that money is the image of a rival God. You should not love that God and serve that God. You can use it, but don't love it and don't serve it. Now let me be perfectly blunt here. You cannot live to make money and live to serve God at the same time. You're only kidding yourself if you think that you can. If the reason that you're living and the reason that you're working is only to make money for the sake of what that money can buy for you, the money is your God, and you cannot serve that false God and the true God at the same time. Now don't misunderstand me. There's nothing wrong with making money. There's nothing wrong with being rich. God has given a lot of people the gift of making money. But the proof of where their heart is found in what you love the most. The proof that you love God first and that money is only an instrument for your love for Him is found in the fact that you will use a portion of whatever money God has given to you to help others without seeking any recognition for yourself. Now, with that said, I understand that you need money to survive, so you have to retain some of your money to support yourself and your family. But if God has blessed you with enough to help others, don't be Ebenezer Scrooge. Just be good stewards of what God has given you. It's also found in the fact that you don't worry if God decides to take it all away from you. The suicide rate is so high among rich people today because they are so worried that someone will take their money away or they'll make a mistake and lose it all. See, money is not given to you solely for your benefit. It is given to you so that you can be a good steward of it and so that you can use it to benefit those that the Lord has placed in your path. And the number of people that you are expected to help is in direct proportion to the amount of money that God has entrusted to your care. So remember what Jesus said, and I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth. So you can't use your money only if it benefits you and really love God at the same time. If you use money only for your own pleasure or for your own convenience, then no matter how religious you may act or how orthodox your theology may be or how faithfully you are attending church, you're not fooling God, you're only fooling yourself. That says you love money, and that money is your God. And you cannot serve God and money at the same time. This is why Jesus said, "For it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God." Now notice he didn't say that it was impossible. He just said it was very difficult because of what Jesus called the deceitfulness of riches. The unrighteous manager couldn't serve his master like he should because he was a slave to money. His love for wealth and his love for what people could do for him prevented him from doing what he should have been doing for his master. Likewise, if we become enslaved to the material things, then we won't be able to serve the Lord either. Verse 14 tells us that the Pharisees who were in the crowd of that day scoffed at what Jesus was teaching. You see, they felt the material wealth was God's reward for their good deeds. Well, in verse 15, Jesus lets them know, in no uncertain terms, that he was aware of their greed. You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. Now listen to what he says next. For what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God. There will come a day when we will all stand in front of God, and when that day comes, we won't have 1 cent in our pockets. At that point, the only thing that will matter is the people who will be standing there with you saying, when I was in need, he or she helped me. And he's the reason that I'm in heaven today. Jesus says, truly I say to you, if you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me. When Jesus made that statement, he was talking about the final judgment when God would separate people like the shepherd separates his goats from his sheep. The amazing thing is the people that God was rewarding because they had used their resources to help others weren't even aware of the fact that they had done anything worthy of a reward. They were just as surprised that Jesus commended their good deeds as the ones who failed to help were surprised at his condemnation. See, to those who truly love the Lord, helping others is such a natural thing for them to do. They don't see it as any big deal. To them, that's just a natural way for them to act. That's just the way they are. It's their nature to do good. You see, God doesn't judge us like we judge people. We look at the things that we do as ways to gain recognition. But God's evaluation of our lives comes in moments when we act unconsciously. You see, it sees us at the moments when we aren't worried about doing what we want others to see us doing. You see, the spontaneous moments of life are where we demonstrate what money really means to us. There are moments that God sees and uses to show us where the heart really is. These are the moments when we demonstrate what we really think is important. The parable of the dishonest manager has a lot to say to us about how we should use the material things that God has entrusted to our care. It shows us that our money and our possessions don't really belong to us. Instead, they belong to God, and we are only stewards of what he has entrusted to our care. We can't use it foolishly, but we are to use it for good. We show ourselves to be trustworthy servants when we use what God has given us wisely and to his glory. We also see that having material possessions isn't good or evil in itself, but it can present great temptations for us. You see, it's how we use those possessions that counts. Jesus shows us that we can invest our wealth in such a way that it will produce spiritual results. Our money can't last because it is material. It's going to disappear when when our stay on the earth is over. But even after all the money's gone, we can still receive spiritual rewards for the way that we used it and the way we while we had it. Our society places a lot of emphasis on getting and using money. That means that money has a lot of power. As followers of Christ, we are to use our earthly riches very carefully and very thoughtfully so that God will be glorified by them. And if we'll do that, God's going to reward us when we get to heaven.